There are moments in music history when the air itself seems to hold a secret, as if it remembers something the world tried to forget. Some say it happened on a quiet Bronx night, when a young man stepped into a future that was still learning how to carry him. Before the crowds knew his name, before the albums and the headlines, there was just the sound of a turntable warming under a street lamp, the soft crackle rising like breath on cold glass. A boy watched the neighborhood gathering around that glow, and he felt the pull of something larger than the concrete beneath his feet. He would grow older, wiser, more certain of the fragile line between hope and danger. He would move between classrooms and shelters, between business ledgers and broken city blocks, still searching for a place where music and responsibility could live in the same room. And though he never said it out loud, those who met him believed he carried a map inside him. A map for what hip-hop could become if guided by someone who understood both the struggle and the structure. This is the story of the man the world would come to know as Scott LaRock. He was born in a corner of the Bronx where cracked sidewalks carried the weight of too many stories, and where the sound of a passing train could feel like a lullaby if you heard it often enough. His parents separated when he was only 4, leaving his mother to raise him and his brother in a neighborhood balancing hope and hardship with equal force. Even as a child, he had a way of noticing people who were hungry before they asked, of sharing what little he had without expecting anything back. It was a small gesture in a city built on struggle, but it said something about who he already was. Someone who believed that care, even in thin portions, mattered. Hip-hop found him long before the world found hip-hop. He watched DJ Kool Herc wire a sound system to a lamppost at a Sedgwick Avenue party, the turntables humming in the open air like a promise being spoken for the first time. The sight stayed with him. People who had nothing suddenly had rhythm, movement, belonging. It planted the idea that music could lift a neighborhood the way a sunrise lifts a dark window. School offered him another path. He grew into his height, into the steady confidence of a 6'3" athlete who could command a gym without raising his voice. Basketball kept him off the corners, kept him in motion, kept him dreaming past the limits of the Bronx skyline. When Castleton State College in Vermont handed him a full scholarship, he accepted it like a door swinging open to a different kind of quiet. Vermont was cold, calm, and mostly white, a world far from the heat and noise of home. Yet he carried the Bronx with him in every record crate. On campus, he studied business administration by day and taught a new language by night, spinning hip-hop at the college radio station, watching curious students lean in as if hearing a heartbeat for the first time. Weekends belonged to Dugan's, a small bar that shook under the weight of crowds that came to see what he would play next. Lines wrapped around the building in temperatures that stung the skin, each breath rising like smoke as people waited just to feel the room explode when he dropped the opening beat. Those nights made him understand something crucial. Hip-hop didn't belong to one neighborhood. Traveled, adapted, translated. And he realized he could be its bridge. He brought friends from the Bronx to Vermont, letting them show the students how to breakdance and paint graffiti. In those moments, he wasn't just spinning records. He was teaching culture, carrying a piece of home into a world that had never seen it up close. By the time he graduated, he understood both the art and the business, how music could move a crowd and how ownership could shape a future. And slowly, the idea began to settle in him. Hip-hop was rising, and he wanted to rise with it. When he returned to the Bronx after college, he carried 2 things with him: a degree that proved he understood structure, and a heart that still believed music could put broken pieces back where they belonged. Working as a social worker placed him in rooms most people avoided, shelters filled with men who had fallen through every crack the city offered. Yet he walked in each day with calm eyes and a briefcase, a quiet contrast to the noise around him. That was where he met KRS-One, long before either of them imagined shaping the direction of hip-hop. Their first conversations were rough, sharp, born from the tension of a place where survival shaped every decision. But over time something softened between them, a recognition that each carried a kind of hunger, one for expression and one for responsibility. Music eventually made them allies. They formed a small collective, first called the Celebrity 3, then evolving into Boogie Down Productions, a name that carried the pulse of the Bronx inside it. Their early recordings made barely a ripple, but Scott LaRock didn't measure success by noise alone. He understood contracts, publishing, branding, the invisible architecture behind every hit. And he believed their moment would come if they kept shaping the foundation the right way. The turning point arrived through conflict, as it often does in hip-hop. A dismissed demo, a harsh critique from Mr. Magic, a spark of pride from KRS-One. All of it set the stage for a musical confrontation with the Juice Crew. But beneath the surface was something more strategic. Scott saw that a well-timed rivalry could become a ladder, that attention, if handled carefully, could lift a young group into visibility. South Bronx hit the clubs with the force of a door swinging open. DJ Red Alert played it again and again because the crowd refused to let the sound fade. Then came The Bridge Is Over, a song that reshaped battle rap and pushed Boogie Down Productions into the heart of a cultural storm. Through it all, Scott stayed steady, the organizer, the navigator, the one who understood that chaos could be turned into momentum. When Criminal Minded was released on March 3, 1987, it didn't just enter the world. It carved a mark into it. The album's raw drums, sharp rhymes, and stark cover. Two young men posed beside weapons they didn't actually live by, captured a moment when art and reality were trying to define each other. Rolling Stone would later place the album among the greatest ever made. But long before that, listeners felt something new inside its sound. A blueprint for what street-centered hip-hop could become. Scott's fingerprints were everywhere. He shaped the beats, the strategy, the message, the movement. He spoke to KRS-One about ownership, about the long tail of publishing, about why short-term money could never match the value of holding your name and your work. And for a brief moment, the Bronx felt like it was rising with him, carried by a man who understood both the music and the machinery behind it. Trouble rarely arrives as a sudden storm. More often, it drifts in quietly, a shadow that grows without being noticed. For Scott LaRock, the shadow began a year before his death, with a phone call that felt small at the time. A misunderstanding involving D-Nice, a young friend he had taken under his wing. Words were exchanged, anger was stirred, and then the moment passed. But in certain neighborhoods, old sparks wait for the right wind. By the summer of 1987, Criminal Minded had already carved its place into the streets. Success can draw light, but it also draws eyes. When D-Nice was later confronted and beaten by the same man who had threatened him on the phone, he called Scott in fear, voice trembling through a pay phone line that still carried the static of the city. Scott didn't hesitate. He gathered a few men, not to retaliate, but to calm the waters, because peace, not violence, had always been the compass he trusted. They searched the Bronx in a Jeep Wrangler that night, windows open to the heavy August air. Inside were Scott, D-Nice, their bodyguard known as RoboCop, the manager Mo, and DJ Doc Boogie. When they found the man who had started the trouble, Scott stepped forward with the same calm he carried into the shelter where he once worked. He talked, he reasoned, and slowly the tension dissolved. For a moment, it looked like the night might end in relief. But violence has a way of slipping through the cracks of good intentions. Another argument broke out, this time between RoboCop and a separate man in the area. A scuffle, a body hitting pavement, a heartbeat of silence. Then the air broke open. Shots came from more than one direction, slicing through the dark. From bushes, from rooftops, from places no one could fully see. The men ran for the Jeep, breaths sharp, shoes scraping concrete in a rhythm of survival. RoboCop took the wheel, the engine roaring as they sped away. At first, Scott didn't realize what had happened. He said he felt dizzy, then asked why the music sounded so loud. A moment later, blood began to fall from the back of his head. 2 bullets had found him, one striking his neck, another his skull. They rushed him to the hospital, where fluorescent lights glowed too brightly for a night that heavy. He was conscious for a moment, long enough to say he felt cold. Then he slipped into a coma, his breathing carried by machines that hummed like distant engines. Doctors declared him brain dead within hours. His mother, facing a choice no parent should ever face, agreed to let him go and allowed his organs to be donated. One final act of giving from a man who had been giving his whole life. Police arrested 2 suspects, Corey Bain and Kendall Newlin, but the case dissolved without witnesses willing to testify. Rumors rose in the silence that followed, whispers of a planned killing, claims from those close to him that business interests and old criminal ties had reached into that night. Nothing was ever proven, but the absence of answers can sometimes echo louder than truth. What remained was a community shaken, a crew shattered, and a future cut short just as it was beginning to unfold. In the United States, the news of Scott LaRock's death moved through hip-hop like a cold wind pushing through an open doorway. For a culture still young, still learning its boundaries, the idea that a rising leader could be taken so suddenly felt like a warning written in the margins of every block in the Bronx. Artists spoke his name in hushed tones, not out of fear but out of disbelief. The kind that settles in when someone who was just planning the next rehearsal is suddenly gone. American media framed the tragedy in familiar terms. Street violence, youth casualties, the volatility of emerging fame. Newspapers reduced the complexity of the moment into headlines that fit the public's expectations about urban life. But within the hip-hop community, the loss felt deeper. Scott had been a bridge between education and street knowledge, between business structure and cultural survival. His death felt like a fracture in that bridge, and people wondered what might have happened if it had held a little longer. Then came the ripple effect. A young fan killed over a gold chain during a tour, crews shaken, promoters nervous, parents worried. These were not isolated tragedies. They were reflections of a culture absorbing the cost of visibility. From this tension, a counter-movement grew, most clearly in the Self-Destruction Project, where artists united not to battle each other, but to battle the violence consuming their communities. It was an American response rooted in both grief and responsibility. Outside the U.S., the reaction carried a different tone. For listeners abroad, in London basements, German clubs, or early French hip-hop circles, the story of Scott LaRock arrived not as a neighborhood tragedy but as a mythic turning point. To them, hip-hop was a distant beacon, a cultural pulse carried through cassette tapes and late-night radio shows. His death felt like part of the growing legend of a movement defined by risk, resistance, and the uncompromising honesty of the streets. International audiences often spoke of him as a symbol, an early martyr of a culture still defining itself. American listeners, however, remembered the man. The social worker with a briefcase, the DJ teaching kids about music, the strategist arguing for better publishing deals. Two worlds, one story. One saw the myth, the other felt the loss. In the end, a life is remembered not only for how it ended, but for the shape it carved into the world while it was here. Scott LaRock's shape was quiet, steady, a line drawn between possibility and responsibility. He had risen from a neighborhood that taught survival and entered an industry that taught ambition. Yet he managed to carry both lessons without losing his center. His legacy lived first through the music. Criminal Minded became more than an album. It became a cornerstone, a reference point for artists who came after and searched for a way to tell the truth without apology. Producers studied its drums. DJs studied its edges. Writers studied its courage. And somewhere inside its layers was Scott, guiding the rhythm, sharpening the message, insisting that ownership mattered as much as talent. But his legacy also lived through the people who carried pieces of him forward. KRS-One would build movements, challenge systems, and shape conversations across generations. D-Nice, after years of guilt, would return to the culture as a stabilizing force, eventually becoming a connector in ways few could have imagined. Even those who once drifted from him kept his influence in the quiet spaces of their work. Then there was his son, Scott LaRock Jr., who grew up with questions no child should have to ask. His struggle became part of the larger story, a reminder that talent lost too soon leaves echoes that reach far beyond music. His voice, years later, added weight to the conversation about what responsibility means inside a community built on rhythm and resilience. Today, a street corner in the Bronx carries his name. If you pass through Jerome Avenue and Kingsbridge Boulevard, you might see the sign catching the afternoon light, its metal surface warming under the sun. People walk past it every day, unaware that a piece of hip-hop's foundation hangs above them like a quiet memorial. His story does not end with answers. It ends with influence, with a blueprint, with a reminder that some of the strongest voices in music were carried by men who spent more time helping others than speaking for themselves. And if his journey stays with you, if it brings back a memory, a song, or a time when music felt like a lifeline, you're welcome to share your thoughts below. Stories survive when we tell them,